Ta-da! Yes. For some reason, I was about to say, yeah, it's Friday, but it's not, is it? It's Monday. It's the opposite of Friday. Cool. I'm glad a few of you are actually having the discussion in the chat there, which I said you should be having, so that's cool. Compiled languages convert source code into machine code all at once, making it fast when it's run, is correct. Interpreted languages translate each line of code as it's read and executed into machine code. Good. Interpreted languages are slow. Compiled languages are fast. It is worth noting that when we say slow and fast here, we are talking about comparatively slow and fast. I mean, when you run interpreted code, it's still going to do calculations and stuff faster than you will be able to do as a human. But when you compare it to the equivalent compiled code, it's going to be slower, in theory. And also, it all depends on like the hardware that you're running on. We're talking in general terms here. Interpreted languages are slow. Compiled languages are fast once compiled. This is correct. However, compilation can take a long time. Excellent. Compiled languages are less susceptible to code injection because there's less freedom to edit. That is good. That's because you get the object code, you get the executable file without the source code sometimes. So there you go. Compiled can only be run on the hardware it was installed on. Okay, so it's not the hardware it was installed on, it's the hardware it was compiled on. Okay, which slight difference. And also you can compile programs to run on specific machines, even if they're compiled on different machines, if that makes sense. So, for instance, you could potentially compile a program on a PC which will run on a PlayStation. I mean, they have similar hardware, but yeah. Anyway. Cool. Okay. What about some advantages, disadvantages of the two methods? Anyone wanna hit me up with some of those? See how much you remember from a few days ago. And also, the subject of freedom came up. Yeah, can someone explain to me what this code injection means? They are less susceptible to code injection. What does that actually mean? What is a code injection attack? I plugged in a USB stick. There we go. Interpreted is platform independent. Well, there is a caveat to that. It's platform independent so long as something. More people can access it. Still, no one wants to volunteer a suggestion as to. There we go. You can add code that you don't want. And what kind of code might you not want? I mean, you don't have to say super hacker code, worms. Yeah, I mean, any code that could potentially cause damage to your computer, because when you run a program on your computer, in theory, you could potentially gain access to a whole bunch of a bunch of parts of the computer which maybe it's best if you don't get access to. I don't know how many of you are big gamers and have been following the general hatred towards de novo copy protection. one of the reasons why people don't like de novo and similar forms of copy protection, like the old Securom and Starforce copy protections, is because they provide what's known as ring zero access, kernel level access, which means you can do a whole bunch of stuff on that machine without requiring confirmation from the user, which means that in theory, if some nasty hacker gains access via that copy protection method, they will potentially have access to running certain like hardware-based routines that could damage your computer. What is de novo? So it's a form of copy protection. Some people have described it as a rootkit. It does behave in a fairly similar way. In fact, some antivirus software picks up the copy protection de novo software as a virus. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Also, it's worth noting that copy protection or DRM software doesn't exist to stop people copying games. It exists to stop people selling games second-hand. It's nothing to do with video game companies trying to stop people from obtaining their games without paying. It is entirely down to them trying to squeeze more money out of legitimate customers. Dear Bobby Kotick, and so on and so forth. Anyway, right, I'm going to get off the subject of all of that stuff. Hopefully your brain juices are now flowing. The source code for most old Nintendo consoles. Presumably, by that you mean the contents of their ROMs. I don't know exactly what you mean by that, but a lot of the old Nintendo consoles and the old Sega consoles have been emulated pretty thoroughly, and a lot of that was down to sort of like reverse engineering the hardware to find out how it worked. But yeah, I mean, my general attitude towards video game piracy and whatnot is, if I want to play a game, I will pay for that game. But if I pay for a game and it becomes more difficult for me to run that game than if I'd have not paid for the game, then I want my damn money back. You know, I think that a lot of the copy protection stuff goes against what they claim it's there for. When you make it easier for pirates to play your game than you do for legal citizens to play your games, then you're shooting yourself in the foot. It's same with movies as well. If I pirate a movie, I don't have to sit through half an hour of unskippable trailers and adverts. I just watch the movie. And so when you start making it more difficult to legitimately purchase this stuff, then of course people are gonna turn to piracy, aren't they? But as I said, if I want to play a game, I'll pay it. I'll pay for it. If I'm not paying for a game, I just ain't gonna play it. You know, because if something's worth playing, it's worth paying for. And if something's not worth paying for, it ain't worth playing. So there you go. Trailers are the best part of going to the cinema. I mean, that says a lot about the current quality levels of movies. Incidentally, last night I watched Doom Annihilation, which is a recent movie based on the Doom video games. It's awful. It's absolutely terrible. Would recommend either not watching it or only watching it with a group of friends so that you can laugh at how god-awful it is. Anyway, worth noting as well that virtually... you tell me. Virtually all video games, do they use interpreted languages or compiled languages, and why? We've got one for compiled so far. Anyone else want to weigh in on this? video games, do you think they use interpreted languages or compiled languages, and also why? So to prevent the people taking the source code compiled so people can't edit the contents, I mean that's certainly one reason why they might use compiled, because it runs faster and it's more secure. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a lot of games that allow people to create mods, but that's not changing the core functionality of the game. What if I was to tell you, however, that some video games are not written in interpreted languages or compiled languages, because not even compiled languages can provide the speed that is required. They have to go one step further. It is less true these days than it used to be, but certainly in the 90s, most of the games that were released on 16-bit consoles were not written in an interpreted language. They were not written in a compiled language. They were written in an assembled language. So that's, yep. Let's have a look at that, because that's what we're going to have a look at today. So let's just skip down. Boom. Assemblers. That's what we're looking at today. We are looking at assemblers. So I just out of interest here, have any of you heard the term high-level language and low-level language? Is that entirely new to you? Someone, I don't know. I mean, obviously, I'm not expecting anyone to know about high-level languages and low-level languages. I'm just interested to know. English equals low-level language. English is actually not a low-level language. English is a very high-level language. But the low and high here does not mean better or worse, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what I mean by high-level language and low-level language, right? But I need you to use your imagination for this. Okay, so imagine on the ground is the CPU. Okay, can you all do that? Can you all? I mean, I know kids these days have absolutely no sense of imagination because no one reads anymore, right? But I'm asking you to imagine this very simple thing. Okay, so on the ground, the ground is the CPU. Can you imagine that? Excellent. Now, if you're on the ground and you want to talk to the CPU, you're going to use binary. You're going to speak in ones and zeros, right? You're there on the ground. You can talk to the CPU directly, but you have to use ones and zeros, okay? Now, if you move up away from the ground a little bit, yeah, there will still be someone down by the CPU who can talk ones and zeros, right? But you want to use language is a little bit more easy for you to understand, and so you use a different language and you tell it to the guy who's next to the CPU who's talking ones and zeros, and he translates it for you. Okay, now you've got to keep things reasonably simple. Yeah, you've got to use code which is kind of similar to the ones and zeros the computer understands. However, someone else is a little bit further above you and he thinks, no, I'm not dealing with that sort of that kind of language. What I'm going to deal with is I'm going to make my own language, which I'll then pass on to you. You can work out all the different steps down there. You can then pass it on to Captain Binary on the floor there, right? The idea is that the lower down you are, the more similar your language is to the ones and zeros that the computer understands. Okay, so when we're talking about high and low level languages, we're not talking about which one's the best or which one's the worst or anything like that. We're talking about how much it differs from the language that the computer understands. Okay, so a low level language is much closer to what the computer understands. A high level language is further away. It has to go through more steps before it gets translated. Okay, so here's an example. On the left, On the left, you may recognize some Python code. Do you recognize that Python code? Someone tell me what that Python code on the left is going to do. Yeah, add two numbers. Well, specifically, it's going to ask the user to enter a number, and then it's going to ask the user to enter another number. It converts both of those numbers to integers, it adds them together, and then it outputs them. Okay, 3 lines of code. In fact, at this point, I'm going to show you the difference between an interpreted language and a compiled language. Now, both of these interpreted languages and compiled languages that we're going to look at are high-level languages here, right? On the right-hand side here is a low-level language. We'll get back to that. Okay, so we're still focusing on high-level languages, right? But one is going to be compiled and one is going to be interpreted. So let's bring up the Python code. Boom. Okay, we've got some Python code here. Yeah, you should hopefully all recognize this as Python. If I run the program, here we go. Enter your first number. Someone give me a number. In fact, give me 2 numbers. First number is going to be, it's like a satellite link up this, isn't it? There's so much latency in the communication. Right, we've got 7 and we've got 9. Okay, can you add 7 and 9 together? What is the total of 7 and 9? Let's see if you can you win this race. I've typed in 7. I can see it on the screen there. I'm going to type in 9 here. I'm about to hit enter. Can anyone tell me what the answer to 7 plus 9 is before I hit the button? It is 16. Well done to James. So 7 plus 9. So, I mean, straightforward, right? There's nothing about that program that you guys don't get. Yeah? So, for the sake of this demonstration, to prove that what I have been saying in the last couple of lessons is not nonsense, let's just mess this up, right? So, no, I'm not going to mess it up that way. What am I going to do? Total equals num1 plus num2. I am going to try and print out, instead of adding num1 and num2, I'm going to say total equals num plus num2. Now notice num, this is an error, right? There is no num variable. There's only num1, there's num2. This is an interpreted language, so at what point do you think the program is going to crash? Tell me how far through this program we are going to get before it crashes. Third line, yeah. So what was the output of the program be? And for bonus marks, can anyone tell me what the error message is going to be? Undefined variable. Let's have a look. Let's run it. Okay, enter your first number. So this is the line 1 there. We're going to put in 4. Enter the second number. This is line 2. And here we go. Let's put in 6. And we get traceback. Name error. Name num is not defined. Okay. So we ran this line, we ran that line, okay, and then we tried to run this line and it didn't work because this doesn't exist. Okay, this should be nothing new to you, right? However, let's look at the same program in a different language. He says, hopefully, making that actually appear. There we go. Is that on the screen now? Apparently not. Let's bring it back. Get rid of that. There we go. Right, okay, cool. So this is a different language. This is C++. This is a compiled language, not an interpreted language, but it does exactly the same thing, right? You don't have to understand this language, right? But you've probably already noticed some differences between this and the previous language, right? First of all, just looking at the two examples, what was the main difference that you saw? If I bring the pie chart back there's my Python program. Here's my C++ program. Just by looking at them, you can already see there's way more lines of code in there, right? Now, it's not always the case that compiled languages have more lines of code, but it is fairly. It does happen quite frequently, and that's because the interpreter does a lot of the stuff which you have to actually code into your compiled programs, right? It's called boilerplate stuff, right? So first of all, we have to include an extra library. That's like import in Python. So and the IO stream library that's for doing output and input, as well as various other things. But basically, C++, you can't do input or output without including this, right? This is us setting up our variables. I've declared a variable called num1, I've declared a variable called num2, and I've declared a variable called total. What is the data type of all of those variables? What is the data type? Int, which is short for... Yeah, short for integer. Good. So we know that these are going to be numbers now. We don't have to do that in Python. Python uses what's known as duck typing or dynamic typing to look at the data which is being stored in those variables and adjust it accordingly. C++ can't do that, right? It says, right, I need to allocate a variable. Cool. What type of data is it? You need to tell me, otherwise I can't do it for you. Now, some of you might be familiar with the there is a keyword in C++ called auto, which will automatically detect, but you still have to specify that. Okay. So we now have this. We're accessing the standard library and we're doing cout. So cout is console output, so this is equivalent to saying print enter first number, right? And then we're using the standard library again and console input. So these two lines enter first number is going to be output on the screen, and then it's going to read in what we type and store it in the variable num1. Those two lines there are the equivalent to this to this one. Well, actually, this is actually 3 lines in one, because we're outputting that information, we're inputting that number, we're converting it to an integer, and then we're storing it in that variable, right? But here in the C++ program, we actually have to define the variable here, we have to output some stuff to the console, we have to read it in, okay? So there's more stuff in there. It's worth noting this still is not a low-level language. This is still high-level language. Okay, it's still a high-level language. It's just we have to do a little bit more, right? So I'm not going to go through the whole of this code. It's basically, you have to trust me here when I say this is exactly the same as the other thing. In fact, if I just add some numbers together, there's my 4, there's my 7, boom, we get the total 11. That's all correct. And if we were to actually time it, I would imagine that even though we're talking like fractions of a second, this program would run quicker. Okay. However, I am going to break it in the same way that I broke the other one, and that was, instead of putting num1 plus num2 here, I'm just going to put num plus num2. Now you can already see my IDE has coloured that in red to show that there's an error. Okay. Oh, hi, Mum. How's it going? And if I run the program again, you can see it's trying to compile we don't get any output. Nothing has run because there's an error while compiling. But you'll notice that even though the program doesn't work and won't compile, we still get an error message that gives us an indication as to where our error occurred. Okay, so in many ways this is a little bit more descriptive than the Python one. Num was not declared in the scope. Did you mean num2? Okay, so we didn't mean num2, but at least it gave us a suggestion as to what our variable might be. Okay, so does that give you an idea of the difference between interpreted languages and compiled languages? It's worth noting that both of these languages are high-level languages. Okay, are we all clear on that? Just say yes or no, or feel free to ask me for further explanations. These are both high-level languages. One is interpreted, Python. One is compiled, C++. Okay. Any questions or confusion at the moment that you want me to explain? Cool. We're looking good. Right. So both of those are high-level languages. We're now going to go back and we're going to have a look at a low-level language. Okay, so let's just get rid of my C++. There we go. So here we go. I will get on to your question, Alex. That's literally what I'm about to explain. So on the left, we have a high-level language, right? On the right, we have a low-level language. This is what's known as LMC assembler. LMC stands for Little Man Computer, which was designed to teach people about assembly language. Okay, so I'll just go through this. I mean, just looking at the difference between Python and the assembly language, what's the main thing that jumps out at you? What do you notice about the difference between this here and this over here? It is assembly language, yeah. Well, it's not assembly language for a specific CPU, it's LMC assembly language. There's lots of different commands. One's longer than the other, yeah. I mean, have a look at the commands themselves. One appears to be a series of opcodes, yes, and that is exactly what the assembly language is. It's a series of opcodes. INP is short for input. Okay, what that means is read some input and then store that input in the accumulator. Yeah. STA, store the data in the accumulator at a specific memory address. In this instance, we're saying store the data from the accumulator in whatever memory address is referenced by this label num1. Well, down here we've got a label num1 which is dat, and bear in mind that when this program is loaded, each one of these things would be at a separate memory address, right? Yeah, so you probably recognize this stuff from when we looked at the fetch, decode, execute cycle. Okay, because in assembly language, every single instruction that you type is directly linked to a specific opcode. Okay? Now, the computer still doesn't understand the text. It has to be converted to binary. So each command, each instruction in assembly language will be converted to a binary sequence which forms the opcode for that specific instruction. Okay? So in this instance, we're inputting something and storing it in the accumulator. We are then storing that data from the accumulator in the memory location num1, which is down here. We are then inputting again and storing in the accumulator. We're then adding whatever is stored in the accumulator to whatever is stored at memory location num1, okay, and then we are storing whatever is in the accumulator in the memory location total, and then we're outputting whatever is in the accumulator, and then we're stopping the program. Okay, now obviously this is because this is little man computer, this is not assembly language which is going to run on your computer specifically, because every single CPU has their own set of instructions. I want to learn assembly for the x86, but I don't know where to learn it. I've got some resources for teaching x86 assembly. I'll drop it in the comments or something like that. Okay, yeah. Marv is a command which is going to move things around in memory and stuff like that. But the thing to bear in mind is that if you can't say I know assembly language. I mean, what you can say is I know the concept behind assembly language and I know the specific opcodes for whatever CPU. So the first assembly language that I learned was 6800 assembly language for the Motorola 6800. I then later learnt 68000 assembly language, which that was the CPU that the Commodore Amiga used. Well, it's 68002. But it's the thing with this is, well, you tell me, right? If each of the instructions that we type in maps directly to a specific opcode in the CPU, whereas over here our Python has to be converted into a number of different instructions. Which of these two do you think is going to be faster? Yes. It's like now, James, can I just point out none of this code on here is C++. Okay? This over here is Python, this over here is assembly language. Assembly language is low level, right? The lower level your language, the faster it will run, because the less messing around it needs to do, because all the CPU can do is carry out the instructions stored by its opcodes, right? So, if you haven't already noted it down in your notes, it's well worth noting high-level languages are languages like Python, like C++, like C#, like Lua, right? Whereas low-level languages are basically assembly languages. The point is, every single instruction, and it's worth writing this down, every single instruction in a assembly language program maps directly to an opcode that is used by the CPU. Okay? In fact, I've got a slide about that here, right? Here's some advantages and disadvantages of low-level languages. Oh God, don't talk to me about Temple OS. The guy that made that, wow, I have to feel sorry for him, because he did something amazing, but he completely lost his mind. Yeah, madness. For operating system, would there opcodes for changing to 64? Right, okay, so when we're talking about 64-bit and 32-bit, you cannot write a 64-bit program which switches between 64-bit and 32-bit operation. That's not how it works, right? In Windows, when you're running a 32-bit program, it actually emulates the 32-bit hardware, because that 64-bit and 32-bit refer to the word length, and word length is how much data can be processed at once, and that includes the opcode, the addressing method and the memory address, the operand, which you're operating on. Okay, and they're totally incompatible. 32-bit and 64-bit. It's not the same. You cannot run a 64-bit program on 32-bit hardware. Technically, you cannot run a 32-bit program on a 64-bit operating system. What happens is the operating system emulates the functionality of the 32-bit stuff. In fact, if you have Windows installed, if you have a look, you will notice there is a folder. You have in your Windows folder, I believe there's a folder called syswow 32 or syswow 64. WoW 64 means Windows on Windows 64. That's the emulation libraries. Same with Linux as well. You won't be able to directly run the 32-bit programs, but there will be a whole bunch of. You have to have the 32-bit libraries installed in order to run that stuff. Okay. Why allows access to hardware an advantage and a disadvantage? Yeah, I'm going to get onto that. Okay, so let me just go through this. Right, so low-level languages, super fast for obvious reasons. It allows direct access to the hardware, which can be a very good thing. Okay, if you've got direct access to the video card, for instance, you can instantly shove stuff into video memory, and in fact, that's how old games in the 90s managed to get a lot of the speed that they got, was the fact that they directly wrote to the video RAM, which meant things directly got shown on the screen, right? Good for programming embedded systems with low resources. Obviously, if you've hardly got any resources, you want to make the most of them. I don't know how many of you are fans of Elite, the video game. The original Elite on the BBC Micro, when David Braben wrote that, the memory requirements were such that there wasn't enough system RAM to make the game run. So what he did was he programmed it so that it would, after you loaded the game, it would overwrite parts of the system RAM which were reserved for the operating system, which meant that you couldn't actually quit the game and go back to like what you were doing. You had to like physically reset the computer so it could reload that stuff. I mean, and in my mind as well, having limitations makes for better programmers. And it makes for better games, it makes for better programs, right? If you're working within a limited scope, you have to think about what you're doing. But if you just say, let them buy more RAM or something like that, then you end up with nonsense games, and then you are EA. Anyway, so embedded systems generally will be programmed with a low-level language. Disadvantages of low-level languages: they are difficult to learn for obvious reasons. One of the reasons that are difficult to learn is that each of those commands, it's usually a 3-letter mnemonic, and it's not really easy to get your head round. A high-level language is much easier for a human to read. Okay, so the more easy it is for a human to read and understand, the higher the level of the language, right? The more difficult it is for a human to understand, but the easier it is for a computer to understand, the lower the level, right? Allows direct access to the hardware is also a disadvantage, because if you have direct access to the hardware, in theory you can cause damage to that hardware. Now, I'm not talking necessarily about malicious damage to the hardware, but accidental damage to the hardware as well. The modern motherboards are kind of doing away with the old style of BIOS, and they're using something called EFI, and it's possible to, if you know what you're doing, or if you don't know what you're doing on accident, overwrite sections of the EFI which will brick your motherboard, which is obviously not a good thing, right? So it's a kind of a double-edged sword. Okay, direct access to the hardware can be a good thing, but at the same time, if you have direct access to the hardware, it means that there's no checks as to whether or not you should be allowed to access that hardware, if that makes sense. Okay. The other disadvantage of low-level languages, and this goes hand in hand with being difficult to learn, every CPU requires a new set of instructions. Now, at A level, you learn about the difference between RISC and CISC CPUs, but we're not going to go into that level of detail here. Those of you who are doing A level, or planning on doing A level, might want to put a pin in RISC and CISC, and we will come back to that. Okay. Any questions? Any questions on the advantages and disadvantages of low-level languages? Because you know what the next slide is, right? I've got a slide of advantages and disadvantages of high-level languages. Oh, yeah, don't talk to me about soft RAM. There's a great video somewhere about how that soft RAM was a total con. Yeah. How does the computer understand this stuff? It's converted to binary. Okay, it doesn't just understand the words. It can't understand the words, right? You have to run this through an assembler. Okay, similar to a compiler, but an assembler. So what it will do is it will take those commands, it will convert them to the ones and zeros that the computer understands, and that's how the computer can run those programs. Why is there a 512-byte boot sector? I'm not entirely sure what that has to do with CPUs, because boot sector's related to hard disks and stuff. So yeah, I mean we're sort of getting off topic there. So are we all good on the low-level language? Can I move on to the high-level language? Yeah. I mean, the purpose of the boot sector is to allow the hard disk to chain load the operating system which is stored on it. That's why viruses that overwrite the boot sector can knacker up your whole computer, because the operating system can't load anymore. Is that? Well, maybe we'll do a lesson on that sort of thing. Okay, but we're cool here, right? So let's have a look at high-level languages. Advantages, as you would expect. I've put easy to understand. Easy to understand. Obviously, it's not like you can just sit and read any high-level language. It's easy for an experienced programmer to understand. If they are familiar with the language. I mean, even if you're familiar with assembly language, it can sometimes be tricky piecing together what the different stuff actually does, right? So easy to understand, relatively speaking. The advantage does not always allow direct access to the hardware. Now, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Most of the time these days, you will not get direct access to the hardware, which could potentially be a good thing, because it means that you have less of a chance of screwing something up. The other cool thing about high-level languages, they're multi-purpose, they're multi-CPU. You can write code in a high-level language which will work on a bunch of different systems, obviously still within those restrictions that we talked about before. I can write C++ code which I know will work on Windows and Linux, but it will still have to be compiled. I'll have to compile two different versions, one for Linux and one for Windows, and then we get two different executable files, but I won't have to change the code necessarily. Okay, it's not always the case. There's still some little bits, some specific libraries that you might have to change. Yes, you can compile C to machine code. That's what we talk. But assembly language is not machine code. Okay, machine code is ones and zeros. It's binary. So when you compile a C program, what you're doing is you're compiling it into object code, which can then be executed. Okay, so disadvantages: not as fast as low-level languages. It's always the case. If you want speed, learn assembly. Although obviously things are, generally speaking, the speed of stuff is pretty good these days. Again, I've put does not allow direct access to the hardware in both the advantages and the disadvantages column here. Because if you don't have direct access to the hardware, then you might have to slow your program down while you sort of like work around and stuff like that. Generally speaking, though, direct access to the hardware is less important these days than it used to be. Why does each CPU require a new set of instructions in low-level language? Because the instructions themselves directly map to the ones and zeros that the CPU uses, right? Without going in depth into exactly what goes on inside the CPU. When you send an instruction, as you know, you have an opcode, you have an operand, you usually have an addressing mode as well, and that forms a string of binary numbers. Okay, each opcode is always the same set of binary numbers, and that same set of binary numbers always maps to the same command in assembly language. However, not all CPUs have the same instructions. And if they do have the same instructions, they're not always mapped to the same sequence of ones and zeros. Okay, every single CPU of the same type will have the same set of instructions. Okay, so if I've got a Motorola 6800, I can use that CPU, I can grab another Motorola 6800, and I know that the commands will be identical. But if I have a Motorola 6800 and I have, I don't know, a DEC Alpha or something like that, or a Spark, they are going to have different sets of instructions. Okay, does that make sense? Which one usually takes longer to write? Well, the assembly language, the low-level languages, almost always, they require a lot more thinking. They're probably not going to take longer to type out because the instructions are shorter, but usually it takes longer to sort of like process what's going on, because you also in a high-level language, a single instruction might end up getting broken down into 5 or 6 different instructions in a low-level language. Okay, as an example, if you have a Python program which takes 2 numbers and multiplies them together, there are some low-level languages that don't have a multiply function. Yeah, you have to write a loop which adds the numbers together a certain amount of times. So there's that. Renzo wants me to shout him or her out. Still confused as to what an assembler actually is. So an assembler is literally what's on the next slide right here. That's what an assembler does. It takes assembly code and converts it to machine code. So it does the same thing that a compiler does, right? But the difference is the compiler also breaks the commands apart into individual instructions that the computer understands. With assembly language, all of the instructions are already broken apart. So all the assembler has to do is convert the instructions to the relevant binary and store it in the program. Where can I get an assembler? There's lots of Windows, I think, has a built-in x86 assembler. If you open up the command terminal and type in debug or dbg, or at least it used to. I don't know. I don't use that stuff. Right. What do you mean? How does the computer understand this stuff? It's a series of logic gates. Okay, when the ones and zeros come into the control unit, different things get routed around throughout the series of logic gates. I mean, I can't really... It would take me way too long to explain exactly what's going on there. Okay, and you're just going to have to, like, you know, it's not that the computer understands it. It's that the computer is able to reroute different bits of electricity around different parts of the system, and then different bits of electricity come out of different parts of the system, and then that does some stuff with other bits of computer hardware. You know, it's not like the computer says, "Oh, I know what that sequence of ones and zeros means," because computers are stupid. They're just machines. They don't think, right? It's like if you have I don't know, a sequence of taps with water coming in. Some of the valves will be on, some of the valves will be off. Maybe you've got like blue and red and yellow water or paint which is coming in. A different combination of taps being on and off will give you a different color coming out the other side. That's exactly what's going on inside the computer. It's just different bits of electricity that are coming into those different logic gates give different outputs to different parts of it. That's literally what's going on. Okay, so to answer your question, the computer doesn't understand it. Okay, it just takes the electricity and it does stuff with it. But in order to do that, it needs ones and zeros, and that's what the assembler is doing. The Raspberry Pi has an ARM CPU on it. There you go. Cool! Right, so Evie, does that answer your question as to what an assembler is? Or do you want some further explanation on that? No one knows. Does anyone want any further explanation on the difference between assemblers, compilers, and interpreters? Or are we good? And no one said anything ever again. Cool, right, well, I mean, no one's saying anything, so I'm assuming that either your heads have all exploded or you get what's going on. Okay, so feel free to stop me here. Here's this slide again. And for some reason I have yeah, I kind of get it. That's cool. Okay, right. So just to remind you here, I've said this a number of times, but having it up on the screen there for you to read as well. Assembly language is so fast because every single instruction maps directly to an opcode. Okay, that machine code is binary. A lot of people say machine code when they mean assembly language, right? They're different things. Machine code is binary. It's ones and zeros. Now, in theory, you can write a computer program which is just ones and zeros. Obviously, that's a little bit of a head stretch, right? How will the assembler work with a high-level language? It doesn't. Okay, so assemblers only assemble low-level languages. Right? You don't use an assembler to work with high-level languages. If you've got a high-level language, it's either going to use an interpreter or it's going to use a compiler. Okay, James says he was ignored. Was James ignored? What did I ignore? What have I ignored? Assemblers are specific to low-level. Oh, good, there we go. The latency is so high. What did I ignore? Oh, right, yeah, sorry about that, James. To be fair, when I said it, no one had said anything. So there we go. Right, where are we going here? So are we clear on the difference between assemblers, compilers, and interpreters, and what they are used for? Just to make sure that we're clear, I would like you to specify an example language which is used in an interpreter, an example language which is used in a compiler, and an example language which is used in an assembler. Go team. USA. No. Lua, Java, x86 assembly, Python, Java, assembly, interpreter, Lua, compiler, C++, assembler, assembly. Yes, good. You guys are pretty much on the money. It's worth pointing out Java is kind of a weird one, and that's because it's a compiled language, but you still need to have Java installed to run it, because it doesn't. It's when I said compiled languages have to be compiled for a specific machine. That's still true with Java, but the machine that you're compiling it for is something called the JVM, the Java Virtual Machine. Java's odd. But then Java's always been odd. Java is sort of like the weird ginger stepchild of compiled languages, because you write the Java, you compile the Java, and then you can run the Java on any machine that actually has Java installed. So there we go. That, incidentally, C# started out as Microsoft's proprietary version of Java. If you imagine, one of the downsides with Java back in the early days was because it ran on a virtual machine, it was actually slower than most compiled languages at the time. And so Microsoft, in their infinite wisdom, said, hey, why don't we make something which has all of the disadvantages of Java and none of the advantages? And that's how C# was born. Now C# has matured quite a lot since then, so I can't be too down on it. But there's a little bit of programming language history for you. Right, if no one else has any more questions, then your next thing for you to do is complete the third section of the worksheet. Okay, so that worksheet, you should have done the first two questions, which were about compilers and interpreters. Time for the third. Holy C, man. Holy C. I mean, it just shows the genius of the man who invents his own programming language to write his own operating system, while at the same time being absolutely insane. So yeah. Okay. Well, if there's no further questions and you're all clear on what you need to do now, then I will sign off. I'll give you a couple of seconds to ask any questions that you might have. I need to eat lunch, lol. I do as well. Not sure what I'm going to have. Aldi, by the way, has a good range of vegan products. Highly recommend. And they also came out top on a recent environmental audit in terms of providing locally sourced food and veg. So there we go. and also Black Lives Matter and trans rights.